Thank you so much, Michael and Nadia, for putting this together from our school. And a big welcome to Kali, who I believe had to come in from some other things. So thanks for parachuting in. Let me just take a few more minutes to give context. And again, welcome everybody from so many different places. About 6 years ago, when I landed at what's now the School of Labor and Urban Studies, then the Murphy Institute, and I mentioned I wanted to get involved with co-ops. I thought it was such an important part of working with workers and community. Someone said, but we don't do business here. And I said, but we do worker justice here, and we do community justice here. And we have to think about how we use businesses towards that end. There's a saying, an expression some of us might be familiar with when Karl Marx says workers need to own the means of production. What does that mean? And what does that mean in the crises that come forward? So we're at a college. I said, let's do it through education. That's going to be the vehicle. So we've been able to, over these past few years, put together a number of things with partners in New York City and around the country that get to really elevate and bring forward some of the educational models for people to learn together and work together. It's a fundamental way that we advance is when we learn together as we work. And I'm very excited that we were able to put together a graduate level certificate in this. That seems like just the beginning of where we'll be promoting a lot of education in cooperative economics and workplace democracy. So I wanted to add that so that we understand that the conversations around co-ops really can belong anywhere. There's conversions where businesses might want to sell to their workers, or where workers may want to take over the businesses. And we see those in the case studies in the report that Michael Lalande just referenced, and we'll put that in the chat later. There are startups where people just go ahead and start the company they need to do the work. And I think that that's a very important thing for us to think about in the face of climate catastrophes and economic collapse around us, how people also begin to work together. When I was growing up in New York, community control became something I was aware of in the school systems. That said, it's not really about integration, it's about control. And that gave me a very important fundamental perspective about understanding racism, being anti-racist, supporting Black liberation all along the way. In my early adult life, I learned from people from the Republic of New Africa the expression free to land. And I wanted to channel the free to land here. I want to thank the ancestors of this part of the world, the Canaries people, the Nape people who stewarded this land before it was occupied. And I want to honor an ancestor that I respect greatly, Kwesi Balagoon, who taught me so much about what it means to free the land and for people to embody liberation in anything they do. That's probably enough from me on the introduction. I want to now really introduce Kali Akuno, who I've gotten to know over the years. And in the past few months, he was scheduled to teach in April and had some issues around health. And so we just kept talking in preparation for today, and I hope we can bring that forward. Kali has a rich history of his own that he'll reference, and coming to us from Jackson, Mississippi. Welcome, Kali.
Thank you all. Honored to be here. Unfortunately, I'm still dealing with health issues. I was doing some house chores last night and slipped and fell playing with the dog in the mix of that. And unfortunately, I've been battling a couple of a bulging disc in my lower back since August of 2020. Which have inhibited me. So I was getting some extensive work done so I could, stand up and not be bedridden for who knows how long with some issues. I have a great physical therapist and he just hooked me up. So I can't sit down yet, but I can stand. So I'm still in a little bit of pain. So if I'm not at my wit is not as sharp as it usually is, I ask you ahead of time to forgive me. You can probably hear some of the pain in my voice, those of you who know me. But I didn't want to miss because of another little freak accident that My dog Sayori, I think, has it out to get me some little revenge play since we missed earlier in the year. So it really is a double pleasure to be here. I really mean that. You know, being injured has not been fun, and definitely was looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Colleen, and thanks for coming, even though you've been through treatment. And I think, you know, part of understanding cooperative economics is understanding that we bring our whole self each moment. In one of the classes I teach on cooperative management for a changing world, I say, you know, we bring our trauma, we bring our hope, we bring our ancestors, we bring our descendants, and we bring the pain of the moment along with the hope. So I want to welcome you with all of that. When we were talking, I'll just jump in, maybe it'll help you if I have questions and context. So a lot of people know Mississippi has been in the news recently because of the abortion rules that are going before the Supreme Court. And when you and I were planning this in April, Mississippi was in the news because of a deep freeze and the pipes froze. Right. And I mentioned these two things as in the news just before our scheduled talks, not only because, but because in many ways, I think it's important that we look at Jackson and Mississippi and the experiences there as canaries in the mines. And for people who don't know what that is, because I am sensitive to a lot of my immigrant friends and students for whom English is not the first language, so a lot of our expressions don't make sense until we explain it. So the canary in the mines were used when miners would have to be down underground, and they would bring a canary who may suffer quicker than they from poisoned or lack of oxygen. And so when the canary dies, they know we better get the hell out, we will be next. So I want to really honor and respect those of us at any point who end up really being a canary in the coal mine and saying, look here, look here. So when the water froze, when sewage lines bursted, I want you to talk a little bit about what's going on in Mississippi and how you are experiencing this as the canaries in the mine.
Yeah. So first, just want to set a context. So everyone, you know, just has some general understanding of how we're situated. So Jackson, Mississippi, is the capital, city of Mississippi. It's the largest city in Mississippi, but it's a shrinking city. At its height, roughly in the 1950s, the city had a little bit more than 400,000 people living within it. And it was a majority white city at that time. It is now a majority Black city. It's been a majority Black city since the mid 1980s. And its population has steadily declined, in part because of white flight, but more importantly still, I think, because of the nature of the very intentional divestment that has happened in the deindustrialization that has happened within this overall context, which has been very much intentional and very much planned. But the city now has between 180 to 160,000 people. And that is a steep decline from where we're at just 2010, which was close to 220,000 people. So that's, anywhere between 40 to 60,000 people who have, I would argue, been forced to leave this capital city because of the declining conditions, both with our infrastructure, but also because of ongoing gutting of the city's industries, which are forcing more and more people to flee to where they perceive there to be greater opportunities. Now, what do I mean when I say that about our infrastructure? So just one thing to harp on, and that is our water infrastructure. Jackson is not as bad as, you may hear about with Flint, Michigan, for instance, or some of the indigenous reservations. But we have several features. We have old lead pipes, which are well over 120, some 150 years old, which formed the core of the infrastructure of the water delivery system here in Jackson. And then there's just tremendous sludge and then conditions that are just caused by the geology of where we're situated. Jackson, like many places that were colonized without paying due attention to indigenous knowledge, a good chunk of it was just built on top of a swamp system, a bog system, and is filled with what's called yazoo clay, a special type of clay that exists here in Mississippi, red dirt clay, which moves, right? And it makes our road infrastructure terrible. I mean, infamously terrible, which is bad, for like particularly heavy industry and all the trucking industry to be able to move goods and services within the city because of its poor infrastructure in that particular way. So this really was brought home during kind of the great polar vortex freeze that happened earlier this year. Now that occurred in February. It was a record-breaking freeze that lasted about 3 weeks. Now, mind you, some of you who are in New York or the Northeast region might laugh at a city or a place being below freezing for more than 2 weeks, right? You guys may have a couple of months where that's kind of the average temperature. We're here. That is not typically the case. And we've been suffering through these kind of new polar vortex events as a result of climate change really over the past 5 years, where it's typically been abnormal for us to get these major freezes, but now they're becoming a very frequent occurrence. But we've had 4 in the last 5 years that have done major damage to the city's infrastructure and to a lot of even our work. When we first started doing urban farming, for instance, we were operating on the traditional guise that here in Mississippi, you can typically plant all year round, different things that you can plant. But we've had 3 over the 3 years, we've lost entire crops because we were not prepared for fully prepared for the changing dynamics, this changing polar vortex. Even with our hoop houses and things of that nature that we call ourselves learning from, earlier this year, just really wiped us out. This polar vortex freeze, this 3-week freeze, basically just caused pipes to burst, to freeze and burst all over the city. And that resulted in the city of Jackson, large chunks of it being without running water. I'm not just talking about, little trickles or brown water, which is common enough and bad enough, but large parts of the city had no water for over a month and a half. Now, many places you would figure that to be unimaginable in a quote unquote developed country. But these are the terms and conditions that exist here. And when you talk about the canary and the gold, the canary in the mine, our city, with this infrastructure crisis, we argue with everybody, this is coming to you. And in many places, it already is where a lot of our folks are because of the lack of attention to both detail, but also the divestment that this particular stage of capitalism has been operating in, particularly in Black and Latino, Asian, indigenous communities. Ours is just at a much more advanced stage of it because of how long it's been going on, how very intentional it's been going on. And when I say intentional, I mean, remember, this is the capital city of the state of Mississippi. And because it's been, controlled politically, primarily by Black forces since the 1980s. Now, we didn't have the formal mayorship till 1997. It's kind of the pinnacle of local municipal power. But because of that, there's been a very intentional divestment, where the state just refuses to put any funds in to repair the city, even though the state government is here and has to use those services. So a classic example of that is the current mayor, Chokwe Antar Lumumba, has been struggling with the current governor to be like, look, you work here, you live here, There's no way when you know that the basic infrastructure repair just to deal with the freeze, not alone everything else that's wrong with the water system and everything else would cost roughly about $4 billion. The best that they were willing to offer was $35 million from the state in exchange for controlling the water system. So I'm going to give you not even a tenth of what you need, but then demand control of it. So I want to just give folks to put a context. These are the terms and conditions of how this particular plantation operates. And that's just the context for the work that we are, constantly struggling to do and build as a transformative element and force within this community.
Wow, Kali, water is life as we can honor it. One of the things you've spoken about is understanding the chessboard, understanding the players, and you're beginning to talk about that. And I want to encourage that and get into the micro. So the micro, when I think about cooperative economics, and this might be when I really think of a more simple life, what it would be like if we didn't have a big system of control, but we created our own economy, that the things we need are to be engaged in, I say, is food, care, repair, the arts, and distribution. Food, care, and repair. And the arts brings joy and communication, and distribution lets us get it all around. And so under complete duress and crises, people still will come up with ways to do the food, care, and repair. And to me, this is a little bit of where we see possibility, hope, and also struggle and real work in the face of also having to take on the big players on that chessboard. So I'm asking this sort of, you can bounce back and forth, but a little bit of, I think when I got on the phone with you the other day, because some people know I'm a carpenter by trade, so I'm always thinking about how we fix stuff, right? The real trade in people's hands. And I say, have you picked up some plumbing skills? Has your community picked up the plumbing skills needed to repair? And I think you referred to an article in the Washington Post to me where I saw the photograph of the sewage bubbling up in somebody's front yard, and it doesn't just, that's a lot of pipe that needs repair. And we know from Detroit and the lead pipes and go on Flint. So who's learning these skills, the food skills with growing food, preserving food, distributing food, maybe even down to seed saving. So a little bit of food care and repair and the care, that you need. Somebody asked already, and a question is, are there healing arts around you for you to make use of? So food care and repair and the chessboard.
Well, Jackson is a place in Mississippi in general where what I call the hard skills that you need to live in an industrial society. They are in abundance here, actually. We have plenty of folks who know how to fix the pipes, know how to do electrical work, can fix a car, build a house basically from scratch. There is no lack of skill here, particularly with, I would say, the generation from 40 years of age and above. Now, some of those hard skills, unfortunately, have not been institutionally transferred to younger folks, in part because of how the educational system shifted, but then also just kind of how the labor flows have shifted, right? What there often lacks is an opportunity, right? A context wherein people can practice these skills to repair homes or to build new homes or to build new roads and do that kind of construction. And the biggest barrier to that is understanding the playing field, right? We exist in a context where, to be bonded to be like a general contractor in the state of Mississippi, depending on what types of projects you want to do, but the general insurance to be bonded for that is roughly about $1 million. You know, you have to get one that's roughly about $1 million. That doesn't cost $1 million, but it's a prohibitive feature for many Black contractors to be able to come up with the $50,000-$60,000, you know, cash to keep that license or to renew it. And so that's just one of many barriers that people have. So what you may find, instead of folks being able to be the lead, they're often all that hard skill. It's in a sub relationship, largely with the larger white contracting firms who basically dominate this economy and have dominated it, you know, for many generations. So that's just one thing in terms of the dynamic that you see, and the part of the shrinkage is the kind of the economic pool is being constricted. More and more labor is finding itself having to leave in order to you know, find and create viable livelihoods for themselves. And this has been a dynamic, you know, in much of the South for many a generation. So this is not particularly new. But you know, we have, I think you've heard me talk about this. You know, Jackson kind of has an inverted bell curve where, you know, there are a fair number of young people, and there are a fair number of folks who are, you know, in their retirement at 55 and older. But then there's just a low number of people in their prime working years, between like 20 and 55. And most of them have traveled away. And like right now, one of the big draws away from Jackson has been Houston, where there's just been a ton of work since Hurricane Harvey. So a lot of the skilled labor has migrated there, you know, to find work, and they're sending back basically remittances to their family here, while their parents take care of their children. So that's where you kind of have this inverted curve, you know, that exists here, that shapes the economy and the society, the social relationships here, you know, on a communal level pretty profoundly. But then there's some new dynamics, right? Understanding the field. So one folks to know, just by institutional nature, by far and away, the largest employer in the city of Jackson is government, by far and away, you know, and that's municipal government, county government, state government, and then the federal government. All of that is primarily concentrated here. The second largest employer in town, or source of employment in town. Now, let me back up just a bit. What I mean by if I'm also including in that, just so folks know, the police and teachers, right? Public school teachers in the realm of government employment. Following that, the second largest source of employment here is healthcare, right? Where you see me situated at now. Most of your kind of specialty medical treatment, be it for cancer or be it for heart attack, throughout, is concentrated here. Now, you know, of course, there's some scattered, but if you need any kind of specialty for childcare, you know, cancer and the like, you have to come to Jackson for the most part in the state of Mississippi if you want kind of the tip-top care. And so a large part of that infrastructure is just really concentrated really in two neighborhoods in Jackson. And one of the particular things about while this frames, you know, a good chunk of the employment here, roughly 60% of the folks who work in the healthcare field in Jackson don't live in Jackson, right? They live in the suburbs that surround Jackson, which are not huge, but it means that you know, their income, their consuming income, their disposable income, largely gets spent outside of Jackson and in their areas. So much so that, you know, just to give you something that's striking, that even though this is the capital city, we do not have a movie theater in Jackson proper, not one, right? You have to go to Ridgeland or to Pearl or to Flowood or to Clinton or to Madison, and it's all suburbs that surround Jackson to go to see a movie, right? You cannot find one to see in Jackson proper. So that gives you a sense, just in a microscope, it gives you a sense of what the social relationships here, even though, if you add up the total population of the suburbs, it roughly equals the population of Jackson, even though it's declining. So what you see is that in aggregate is that by themselves, by most economic matrices, most of those suburbs do not actually have the population densities that would justify, at least how they teach you in business school, most business schools, if they can't justify, having a population that would afford the grocery stores that they have there, to sustain the movie theaters. And what they do and what the system here is relied upon is knowing that all this place has been gutted and that most of us, including myself, for certain goods and services, I have to travel to the suburbs. I cannot acquire those within the city of Jackson, right? And so, but all of the people who live in the suburbs, they live off of contracts, that are drawn from the city of Jackson. So there's a huge sucking sound, if you want to call it that happens every day here in Jackson to understand the table, to understand the chessboard. That 5 o'clock, Chokwe used to say, if you look at our freeways at 5 o'clock every day, you see tons of money just leaving Jackson, right? To understand the context. But there's some new players on the field. I mean, I can talk about this, but there's one new player that's on the field that initially I kind of thought was unfathomable, but it shows you sometimes, you underestimate your own context within the dynamic, of kind of capitalist exploitation at your own peril. And what folks may remember, I think it was 3 years ago, Jeff Bezos put out, this big call that he wanted all these, him and his company, Amazon, wanted all of these cities basically to compete in a race to the bottom to be able to host the next major Amazon site. And New York City wound up being one of those. And I think they had initially decided on setting up a distribution site in Brooklyn. And then, there was a remarkable organizing campaign, which basically, defeated that. I think there's still some little aspect going on in New York. You have to educate and correct me. But we never thought a place like Jackson would be anywhere remotely within their scope, in part because the infrastructure we just thought just doesn't exist here. Understanding the field means, understanding the nature of the beast that you're fighting. And so Jackson has become real attractive to Jeff Bezos and to Amazon on the basis of labor terms here in Mississippi, where basically they're, the right to work regime is pretty much ironclad law here. And the right to work, for those of you who, there's a UN definition of the right to work, which means everybody has access to it in a general sense. And then there's the US sense of that term, which means the right to work for less, with less work, with less protections, under whatever terms and conditions your boss wants to, or the employer wants to offer. So often in the worst conditions possible, right? So that's what it basically means here. It's the latter one, the US-based one. They are fully exploiting that now. They've built a fulfillment center out in Canton, which is 20 miles north of Jackson. And there's a Nissan plant, that's there. That we played a role in trying to help unionize over some years. That effort unfortunately failed. And it was in part because of the experience of that. I think that was one of the major draws of Amazon to come here. But also, they've stepped up their investment here this year on the heels of the organizing drive that was taking place in Bessemer, Mississippi. Where initially there was a lot of promise being shown from folks that we were in contact with in Bessemer towards that union organizing drive. And then Amazon did everything it could following kind of your typical Southern playbook, similar to the one that Nissan used here against the folks who were trying to organize the UAW, United Auto Workers chapter here. They pulled out all the stops, intervened in that election, so much so that the National Labor Relations Board just recently said they have to do the elections again, which is largely unheard of in the last like 20, 25 years. So that gives you a sense of how bad it was. But this, the threat of that means that they've concentrated more time, energy, and resources here in Mississippi. And part of what the draw is, in the 1980s, as the city was making this transition to become, majority Black and to wield kind of more power, some of the powers that be, basically, the outgoing mayor, and then it was in '88, created a free trade zone that exists in West Jackson. And that is the draw for Amazon and companies like it that are coming into and doing a new level of investment in Jackson. And so they're building upon this old infrastructure, and they're building upon weak employment laws, weak union laws, to come in and do another round of super exploitation in this community. That is what they're planning to do, and have it operate in a context where they won't be taxed, right here on U.S. Soil. So,
yep.
This is the part of the framing and context that we are existing in, and this is just a small snippet of kind of both some of the old and new forces that we're up against. But the thing I do want to say before we move on, it's critical to put, when we're looking at chessboard, understand Jackson as it's a sub mode of distribution within the overall framework of the movement of goods and services here in the United States. And this is very intentional from its founding. So number one, Jackson was not the original capital city of the state of Mississippi. That distinction belonged originally to Natchez, which is where my family, the family of my ancestors from Mississippi, are from that area, going back to the very founding of this so-called, the founding, the establishment, the colonial state that is Mississippi. That was the original capital, and Natchez is on the river. They set Jackson up because it's more of a natural connecting point. It's kind of in the middle of the state, but it's a much more direct line because of how the Mississippi River bends and twists. It's a direct straight line from New Orleans to Memphis. And during the development of the kind of the new dominant infrastructure of the 19th century, as I remember, that was the railroad. And so what originally created Jackson as a major kind of terminus point was the establishment of the railroads, right in the beginning, the early part of the 19th century. Then that infrastructure was laid upon when, in the 20th century, the New Deal basically started the process of urban renewal, i.e. Negro removal, and established the highway system. So Jackson cuts through with the 20 and the 55. And then that created a new level of infrastructure so that, to understand where Jackson situates, it's connecting the transport of goods and services from New Orleans to Chicago, ultimately, that route, and from Atlanta to Dallas-Fort Worth. And we exist primarily as a little transport mode in between there for goods and services, the goods that come by train or come by boat or come by truck now to be things to and from. So a lot of our strategic intervention in the very model that we built has been trying to figure out how do we build enough power, right, to be able to intervene or intercede and redirect that particular mode, right? And if need be, to be a stopgap measure to be able to exert maximum power to redirect where those goods and services might go as a leverage point. And this is a particular piece that I hope folks have learned more the importance of in the face of this pandemic, and particularly now when you hear about all of these, hundreds of ships that are just docked outside of Los Angeles, the port of Los Angeles, which is the largest port in the United States, and why the supply chain is so weak, right? And why it's so backed up. And we need to look at that, I would argue, as a point of leverage that the working class is going to have to exercise to be able to gain more political strength in the days, months, and years ahead. And this has always been a part of our kind of strategic thinking in the context of the Jackson Push Plan, of some of the things we want to do, some of the things that we want to build within that framework, and why we've always said, for us as an aspiration, we want to start with local production to get to a basic level of food security within our community. But the ultimate aim and objective is to reach food sovereignty within the community. And that means being able to produce enough within the city of Jackson, within its confines, that we can take care of the caloric needs of everyone here. That way food cannot be used as a strategic economic weapon or an actual weapon against us, as we've seen in our history and in the past, in which, given the march of the right now, we know it very much well be a tool that they could leverage against us in the future.
Wow, Kali, thank you. This is such a helpful context. So we're coming closer to the end of our time, and I want to make sure people can start to put some questions in the chat or the Q&A function and give us some questions. I want to ask you to drill down now into some of the daily work of Cooperation Jackson and what people are doing, how they're learning together, what they're doing, because I think it was really important when we spoke to understand, I heard from you that all these crises are strengthening factors for cooperative economics. They are strengthening factors, even though they look, it's a dire chessboard in terms of the players of those in power and the history and how power is taken away and being abused. And then you have worker power, community power, cooperative initiatives. Talk to me a little bit, talk to us all about what that looks like so people can understand what Cooperation Jackson feels like on the ground.
It feels weird to say this, so please take it in the spirit that is offered everyone. But we have kind of turned this pandemic on its head in our context. And through some reorganization that we've done, this has actually been one of the most productive times in our history over the past 8 years. Now, we, on the heels of what we learned from Hurricane Katrina, we tried to create, the founders tried to create a model that could plan ahead and prepare ahead and do enough development and put enough institution in place to be able to address a crisis, and what we mean by address it is not just kind of withstand, what comes, but to thrive through it. And I'm happy to report that preparation came through, and we've really taken, I think, some leaps and bounds in advances in our practice. Now, what does that mean on a practical level? So I'll start with, I think, the first kind of major breakthrough that we had. So we, according to many, made a questionable investment in the creation of a fab lab, right? A digital fabrication laboratory here in Jackson. And with that, created a co-op called the Community Production Cooperative. When you look at the picture on the right-hand side of your screen, that's one of the many kind of tools that's within the Community Production Center. And, when the pandemic hit, one, we have been following it very early, particularly myself. I've been very keen on the spread of these kind of pandemics because I lost one of my best friends in life, a brother by the name of Javad Jaheed, to SARS. So I've been watching these just as a kind of current condition of the advance of capitalism, knowing how deadly they can be from that practical experience of having to witness his transition. So started monitoring this early, beginning in, November 2019 was the first I had heard of some reports of something weird, some kind of weird influenza-like, thing coming on. And then as soon as we got some kind of word that it was heading our way, we took some preliminary steps to start shutting down, production to be on the safe side to the greatest extent possible. But we knew we just couldn't sit down idle, given what we called ourselves preparing for, and we tried to figure out ways that we could help. And initially, we started doing food banking and mutual aid work in that particular regards. Luckily for us, comrades in Italy who had jumped out initially because they were one of the remember it was China, Italy, and Iran that was some of the first major kind of epicenters of the pandemic. They had a little lead time, and all of the folks that we knew in a couple of different cities said, whatever you do, don't do that. You're not prepared for this, right? And we need to learn from that. And they had jumped out there, started doing mutual aid work, particularly amongst a lot of migrant workers, and virtually all of them got sick, and a few of them died, unfortunately. So they gave us kind of heads up, like if you don't have the personal protective equipment to really engage, you don't have the N91, N95 masks, etc. Back off of that. We wisely did, just given how many of our members have pre-existing conditions. But we didn't want to sit idly by. And so also from learning from Italy and being part of the Fab Lab network, our CPC crew started working on masks. And they wind up designing their own masks that they 3D printed and designed that we could start giving out in the shortage of masks that were in our community, primarily to frontline workers. And so by the end of March, the very first iteration of those masks started being produced. And then in April, we started producing the masks that you just saw there in that picture. And those are hand-woven masks that the members of that cooperative started to do, and we started to distribute for free, very pointedly and intentionally, because A, there was a lack of production, but B, the neighborhood that we're situated in is where the largest concentrated of homeless service providers exist within the state of Mississippi. And there's a fairly large houseless population that exists. Those are the 3D printed masks you're seeing there, BMA. A fairly large homeless population, the largest in the state, lives and is concentrated in this neighborhood, in our neighborhood, and a fair number of houseless folks are members of Cooperation Jackson. So we knew very early on the need, and so that is why we jumped in and producing there and started making those masks and just giving them out for free. We're still doing that to this day, and so we're roughly making 1,000 masks a week and giving away 1,000 masks a week to folks in the community. Because even though your kind of standard mass production is back up, the distribution of it does not hit certain communities, particularly now that people have to buy them. So that's the ongoing service that we are just kind of providing in the model. And so what that looks like, is basically there's a team of 6 people who take shifts working in the building that you saw just within that one, sewing and producing and cutting the masks and doing that work, and then going out twice a week to do distribution points at various points in the city. And we go primarily to our plaza, where there's a concentration of homeless folks and folks just know to come. We go to Stew Pot, which is a homeless service provider, primarily providing food into the grocery stores, primarily in the community. And then that is fortified by the ongoing work of Freedom Farms to provide a baseline of just produce, goods, fruits and produce that we also just primarily giving out for free. And this started on an extension of the CSA model that we finally formalized in 2019, shortly before the pandemic. But we just switched that up, recognizing that there was a need, and we increased the production of the farm. So that was one of the major things that happened, that we were able, following kind of a Mondragon principle, we knew in the midst of a pandemic, for instance, that the Green Team, which is our landscaping cooperative, that they probably weren't going to get a lot of work, as people were just kind of shutting down things and not being able to, the initial days in 2020, we didn't want people exchanging money or touching hands and stuff like that. So we shifted that operation and just redirected all of that labor, which was 6 people, redirected all that to expanding production on the farm. And that's gone up, tremendously. So there's kind of the food distribution part, and there's production for need, as we say, right, to meet the community needs, and then there's production to meet, for them to make ends meet. So production for profit, which is largely the things that they produce. Largely now go to 3 restaurants and is sold at a farmer's market and 1 grocery store. So that is kind of what the day-to-day work. Now the work of the Green Team has picked back up, and there's been a boom of that work as, a lot of things in the course of the past year just kind of returned to the forest, literally, in a lot of our communities. So there's just been kind of a near endless supply of work as folks have been redirecting that. But one of the critical things that we did, during that period, we were able, to slow down and then redirect ourselves to a course of study to sharpen our skills, right? But the thing that I would say that the great qualitative leap was kind of a generational transfer of experience and knowledge within our own organization. Now, I don't mean generation by necessarily by age, but where and how people have entered into the organization. So I think, like when we talk about, if you look at our Build and Fight chapter within the Jackson Push Plan, that kind of very projective model of where we want to go, the founders had a root in that, right? And we've tried our best at different times to orient new people to coming into it. And I would say for the most part, you ask people kind of got it intellectually, but they didn't necessarily get it emotively until the pandemic. And now it's been this like, okay, now I see why food sovereignty is so important, right? Because we've actually experienced food shortages, here in this community, when there wasn't enough meat and there wasn't, grocery items were pretty sparse, particularly last summer. And our members, because we have a practice of stocking up food for emergencies, hurricanes, tornadoes, et cetera, and just general crisis as a general practice, folks then kind of understood, this is why we keep all these beans and rice and, why we've been doing this canning and jarring. This is why you've been doing, like, yes, this is for this moment, and there's going to be more moments. And so a political awakening moved from just kind of rhetoric of people, joining in the organization and say that sounds good, to an actual, I think, concrete material understanding. This is why this is important. And you can definitely see it in just this, like where and how the farming activities and other productive activities this last, basic year have just really taken off, and I think it's because as folks, gain a real direct experience with a deeper type of crisis, a new type of crisis, and seeing that we actually have built up the capacity in some, by having the community land trust, having food production, doing these things and laid out. Like the theory started to match the practice in people's own lives. And once they grasped that, people's investment in it just took off, right? And you see that every day. And so, one of the things that we do now, we adjust when we need to, because we've had our own fair share of members getting COVID-19, even though everybody's got vaccinated. We haven't had too much of the anti-vax nonsense in our own ranks. But, we meet every day now, like the past 6 months, every day, 9:00 for a basic overall team check-in, for progress on the work, and to try to determine when and where extra hands might be needed, and can we redirect resources that way, right? And so when the farm says that they need more help, et cetera, at the 9:00 meeting, we can check and we can switch, or when the CPC, the community production says, hey, we need some extra people to work tables or to do distribution or to help us out, with some of the mass kind of making components, we've been able to kind of shift that. And this is one of the things that I think we went back to the drawing board and just really looked at, kind of what was the purpose of Mondragon. And one of the things that really stuck out to us was that, as they kind of frame it, on the front end, was to make sure the people in the Boston region have employment. And how when things, when the co-op is, shuts down or production gets low, because of the constant kind of re-education, that, they can redirect resources. We went back and drew from that. That was really a pickup from Saki, who really outlined that we needed to do that at a certain point. And it was a wonder, from that, we've been actually able to pick up some things which we tried earlier, which didn't necessarily work. And so, on the heels of that now, we're actually starting recycling and a full-on industrial composting cooperative that folks who've come on board from once kind of volunteers have come on and taken that on, and to definitely meet that need, and also learn some of the lessons. Like the previous iteration of that was very much tied to kind of your standard model that folks may even know anything about that know that. I think it was about 4 or 5 years ago, maybe even longer now. But China basically kind of upending the recycling business here in the United States when they just, stopped taking in all the cardboard and plastic in the United States. And the United States didn't have a repurposing and rebuilding kind of infrastructure to take that in, since they were just shipping it all away. So we've articulated, we're going to build a circular one, and they've developed a system that is maximizing how to reuse and repurpose all of those for things that we need in-house, but also things that can be sold directly in the community. So it's not dependent upon some external market for its viability in the long term. So a major period of advance for us on many levels.
Let me jump in because there's a few questions. It's almost 1 o'clock. I think we've said we will run a few minutes over so we can address some of these questions, but also just continue to engage. So for those who have to leave, I know this will be recorded and we'll be able to look at it again. But some of the questions, I'm just going to name them all. I'm going to name a few of them and you can choose. One is really strategies that you see available for growing more Black co-ops in Black communities outside of Jackson. And another one is the relationship between labor and trade unions in terms of membership, organizing, and strategy. Those are two different things, but there's a big overlap of Black people in these spaces. And how do we really look at cooperatives as a strategy? I know you mentioned in your study group that you were actually using the toolkit for cooperative solutions that we've published. And I'm curious more about how Black run co-ops can be a tool in the face of so much. Really, what does liberation look like on the ground? If you can address that a little bit.
That's a whole nother hour of conversation, which I'd love to do at some point in time. I'll start with one thing that I just want. We would advocate that Black, Latino, Indigenous communities cooperatives are definitely a way to go. So that we can try to ensure the maximum control of our own time, energy, and labor, right? And not surrender those to other peoples and communities to exploit. Now, the challenge that we and everybody, I think, in this period is coming up with is, the capital, the startup capital to kind of do anything. I think we have fundamentally been blessed to have a level of kind of grant support kind of early on, but even that, it was supplemental. The fundamental thing, if you want to do that, start saving now and creating a process with the core members that you have to start doing your own saving, because fundamentally these things have to be self-financed, right, in order for them to be sustainable. So you got to start with some saving and then quickly transition, at least on a scale where you can sustain and replicate the resources that you need to continue. That's a big piece. And we've made some mistakes and errors at times, jumping too far ahead and not having the resources or viable, a totally viable plan of recouping that within our own limits. And some of the things we've done with kind of thinking that they would fit into regional or national markets, and that's just wasn't a possibility. Because we just couldn't produce at that scale without another major level of capital investment in. So I'm just kind of giving.
There's a question in the chat that is that relates to this about, are there partners for investment? And so the self-investment is one of the strategies, but where else can we, businesses that start up or organizations or people who are trying to respond, find the resources? I don't know if you could speak about the seed commons, or other.
I was about to mention seed commons, and there's a bunch of other co-op minded regenerative, funding sources that are cropping up, developing, learning. That is one. But I also tell people, start first and foremost developing a relationship, with the credit unions that exist within your community, right? And work on, if they're not serving as the cooperative institutions which they're supposed to be, try to get on their boards and join them and start working to organize them and redirect them. And so, in our case, we don't sit on the board, but we have a great relationship with Hope Credit Unions. It's who we've quote unquote banked with from the beginning, and is now, providing a level of resources to help us out with the development of the community land trust, but particularly kind of the grocery store and the plaza. So there are things that are out there, right? And this is a period where there's a fair amount of money, both in the form of loan and grants that are out there for a lot of startups. So this is a good time to get in it. But I would, I'm one of those people who would tell you, the whim of the nonprofits and the philanthropy, that comes and goes. We can't, depend on that forever. So still finding ways to save and dig into your own pockets is going to be fundamental. Then the piece with the unions.
There is a series of questions coming from a dear old friend. I want to say hi to her. Are there any social services or agencies that have been not co-opted, but what does cooperativism look like inside the social service spaces? And you may have some ideas for that or some experience in Jackson.
Here in Jackson is very thin in that regard. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily call it a social service, but the agency that we can most consistently rely upon for any type of resources and technical assistance is actually USDA, right? And part of that's a feature of being in Mississippi, which is still predominantly an agricultural state. But there's a fair amount of good expertise, at least in the areas that we are, and folks who have some pretty decent politics, who understand the needs of the communities that they're operating in. And always, at least in our case, and I think the Federation of Southern Cooperatives would also say as much, who are trying to find ways to help, Black farmers and small farmers. Now, there's been a ton of discrimination there over the years, and a major lawsuit that had to be filed, which still hasn't been fully paid out, by the way, with all the discrimination that took place against Black farmers. But we found in the last couple of years to be of some help in that regard. But in regards to kind of like city and county, that's been very sparse, right? And in our case, in many ways, we've strategically, at least since 2016, chosen not to really try to do that because they're so sparse. It would kind of be taking resources away from another area that would be needed, because it's really, Jackson really is a place like, if we get 5 cents, that means 5 cents is not going someplace else in the community, right? It really is a zero-sum game in terms of resource allocation around here. And we sit in a much better position than a lot of other working, forces in our city. So that's a conscious choice and decision that we've made here. But we do, seek resources elsewhere. The other piece, trying to get to that before, folks just have to get off. We've had a union co-op vision and strategy since our inception, and trying to move the local trade unions to reunite with the cooperative movement, right? Unfortunately, in the U.S. context, co-ops and union organizing have largely become disjointed, I would argue, since the 1930s. You know, we've been trying to reconnect these two pieces together because they're both tools and instruments of, you know, working class self-organization, right? And so we've been trying to put that together. We've had a mixed bag of experience there, you know, just to be honest, where there's rank and file support, but support from the brass has been less than desired, you know, over the years, and it's different with different co-ops. I mean, with different unions as well. So, like where we have the best relationship with is with the public sector employee union here, and with the teachers union here. In the you know, it's one of those things that's great in terms of relationship, but their union, outside of maybe them, you know, organizing kind of assemblies inside of the actual operation of government, etc. You know, we wind up being kind of more on political support to each other because there's at least no direct way that we see and which that we can set a co-op up for those kind of operations and institutions that wouldn't kind of derail them from being public institutions in some respect. But, you know, where we've been trying to make some headways is primarily in the trucking and shipping industry. And we've been met with some hostility there for some folks. But we're going to keep trying because, look, from our vantage point, if we're going to get to a place where we can really transform society on the basis of our own labor and not be exploited, this union and this marriage between co-ops and worker unions and all these worker centers, we're going to have to develop a comprehensive strategy that draws on the lessons and the strengths and weaknesses of each of those particular forms of working class self-organization.
Yeah, that's a great setup to pitch back to me, Kali, because this report that we produced recently came out of a series of meetings during COVID on Zoom with lots of people identifying real lived experiences where unions were able to play a role. But I might say unionists, not always the union leaders, but the whole notion of early adapters when you have access to power or access to opportunity, which is not unlike really in any crisis, how do we find the point of entry to help? So whether we're talking about lobstermen and women in Maine, figuring out how to deal with a series of regulations that limited their play in the market and shifting that, union was able to step in. A random example that's in the story in the report. But I know that change happens sometimes by, well, maybe not even sometimes, the early adapter, the one who's willing to go into those brambles where it's still lots of thorns and nobody has gone for a while and say, we can go here. And so part of it is really understanding that you and Cooperation Jackson represent early adapting, as do the stories in the toolkit that we reference. What we're doing at the school, and this is sort of a wind down, and I'll let you get the last word, but I want to say, in putting together the certificate program, we identified that any entity that wants to be cooperative needs three things. Let me say four. And this is somewhat an answer to a question in the Q&A from a 15-year-old who wanted to know what they can do. So four things are needed for an entity to run cooperatively: an understanding of the political economy, like you spent a lot of time helping us understand the chessboard, understanding how to run things cooperatively, which really means how do we show up for each other as humans, not as oppressors? How do we liberate ourselves in the present moment to welcome each spirit? Understanding how to run the entity, the finances, so that it can really run as an entity where people can make a living or contribute to the economy of need. And the fourth thing is really the hard skills for the thing. And you spoke about the intergenerational exchange of knowledge. So, you know, I say this in some part to the 15-year-old who asked the question, because what I also say is not only can you study it at college in a graduate place, but you can study it anywhere. These four elements, and I use the globe, the heart, and the hands as the elements, can be studied in kindergarten, right? It's like, how do we show up for each other right here, right now? And there's no wrong place. It needs an early adapter any place. And so as an early adapter, I want to really thank you for showing up and helping us understand what's happening as a canary in the coal mine, to use a couple of metaphors there, but also to know that, the struggle continues in every facet, whether we're taking it on with the large chessboard or we're looking at the microcosm of a business that is trying to make, for example, composting function in a city where infrastructure has been divested. So I'll let you make a final remark, and we'll thank everybody for coming, and I appreciate you. So please give us your last words.
Yeah, I mean, number one, let me just thank you, Rebecca, and everybody for hosting this and putting it together. The last thing I think I'll just really touch upon is that for what's coming, and I think unfortunately there's a period of social reaction that we have to get prepared for, which is bearing down on us hard and fast. Solidarity, mutual aid are going to be critical tools that we are going to need to rely upon, I think, to make it through this next period. And I want to take folks to kind of encourage everybody to go to a source which has given us so much direction and inspiration, both in preparation for those of you who want to take on the task of building cooperatives, but also the political challenge of how do we fight and ultimately, I think, defeat this effort at a second period of redemption, right, that we are kind of living through. And I want to encourage everybody to read, pick up and read W.E.B. Du Bois' Black Reconstruction in America. I think it's a fundamental text that helps us understand where we are at now, and what type of organizing we're going to have to do to defeat it, and not just deal with it, but also there's a fundamental task of getting ahead of the climate calamity and taking that seriously. Like, that is an even deeper challenge that is confronting us in the midst of this reaction. And the reaction, in a lot of ways, is a result of the deepening crisis and the lack of imagination of many social forces to do something different other than continue the systems of exploitation that they have built up over the last 400 years. So rather than trying to do something different, just trying to bear down and continue doing what they were doing, which has led us on this path of destruction. So it's up to us to look to each other, figure out how we work with each other, how do we struggle with each other to be more human and humane to each other, to the environment, to all the relations, so that we make a way for our children and grandchildren. That's really where we're at right now, and we can do it. I always tell people that we have to draw upon the unique histories of all the peoples of the planet. And one thing I can offer as a person of African descent to just try to share as a universalist, to just think about the pain, the suffering, the calamity of those who were held as chattel, and how they didn't quit, how they didn't give up, and how they kept struggling for a better future. If folks can find a way to deal with that, we can find a way to deal with this.
That is our hope, our prayer, our foundation. Thank you so much, Kali. I appreciate you and everything you're doing. I want to thank everybody at the School of Labor and Urban Studies, Aaron, Nadia, and Michael for helping to pull this off from our public programming department. And final words, we put some things in the chat that were referenced, so if people want to save that. And come around again. We'll be doing more of this and showing up as much as we can. Again, Kali, thank you very much.
I thank you.